presentation up already, so I don't have to handle that little bit of technology. Um, just before we get started, if anyone has questions as we go along, I am totally fine with you just unmuting and shouting them out. I don't mind at all being interrupted, or I think you also can ask them in the chat and somebody will pay attention and convey those questions. So happy Fair Housing Month to everybody. Again, my name is Rachel Wentworth, and I'm with the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania. And you can go ahead and advance the slide. So I like to always give a little bit of a introduction to our organization. We were founded in 1956. That was 5 years before the state of Pennsylvania had any fair housing legislation, and it was 12 years before there was fair housing legislation on the federal level. And we're the oldest private nonprofit fair housing organization in the country. So our services cover basically southeastern Pennsylvania, and I'll talk more about, what you can come to us with, what we can do for you, what we can do for your clients. But basically, we serve the greater Philadelphia area and the Lehigh Valley. So those 7 counties, the suburbs surrounding Philadelphia, Philadelphia itself, plus Lehigh and Northampton. So I always like talking about our history with realtors because we were actually founded by a real estate agent. And it's a really interesting history. We were founded by a woman named Margaret Hill Collins. She was a Quaker woman who lived in Bryn Mawr, and she was white. She was friends with another woman from Chester County who was Black named Maisie Hall. And the two of them worked together to make opportunities for kind of casual social engagement between Black families and white families during the 1950s through their Quaker organizations. And then at some point, somebody gave her some feedback on these efforts and basically made the point that, if our families were living in the same neighborhoods, we wouldn't have to have these kind of artificial social events constructed in order for us to get to know each other. So she really took that constructive criticism to heart, and she decided to form her own real estate firm. And so the premise of her real estate firm back in 1956 was to offer all listings on a non-discriminatory basis. So she was, during the time when housing discrimination was legal, she would only accept listings from individuals who were willing to sell their home to a person of any race. And through the 20 years that this company existed, she really began the integration of the Philadelphia suburbs. So of the home sales that she facilitated during that period, she sold 232 homes to Black buyers in 60 previously all white communities. So I really always enjoy sharing a little bit of that history when, during Fair Housing Month, speaking to realtors, because it's an important part of our history. So moving a little forward in time from 1956 to 1968, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and this was passed 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And I believe it was maybe just the day before his funeral or the day after his funeral. It was really kind of an eventful 7 days with the discussion that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And it was really a testament to his work that this last major piece of civil rights era legislation was passed. And then that original law covered four protected classes: race, color, religion, and national origin. And the Fair Housing Act has been amended twice, once in 1974, and that added the protected class of sex. And then again in 1988, which outlawed disability discrimination and familial status discrimination. And then another important part of the 1988 amendments was that an administrative enforcement process was added to the law. So before 1988, if you were a consumer who believed that you had been discriminated against, the only way that you could enforce your rights was through, hiring an attorney and filing a federal lawsuit. And so that was really too high of a barrier for many consumers to attain any type of remedy from this law if they had experienced discrimination. So in 1988, the law added a administrative process through HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And so still today, this is a no-cost process for consumers, and it's how many discrimination complaints are adjudicated. So very basic overview of the law. The Fair Housing Act makes it illegal to discriminate in any housing-related transaction based on the 7 protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, disability. And this is a whole training in and of itself, but that includes reasonable accommodations and modifications in situations where people with disabilities are, need a change in the rules or policies and practices of a housing provider, or if they need to be permitted to make physical accessibility modifications in order to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy their dwelling, they're entitled to reasonable accommodations and modifications. And this is kind of really the day-to-day work of a lot of what we do at our organization. Currently, most of the discrimination complaints that are reported are on the basis of disability, and many of them involve reasonable accommodations and modifications. And then finally, familial status, and that is defined as the presence of children under the age of 18 in a household, and anyone who is in the process of becoming a parent or adding a child to the family. So whether through pregnancy or securing legal custody of a child in some other way. And then I mentioned the Fair Housing Act covers all housing and all housing related transactions. It's a very broad law and really covers any type of transaction that affects somebody's access to housing. So rental of housing, home sales, mortgage lending, and that includes not only purchase loans, but home equity loans, home repair loans, refinances, any type of loan that's secured by a dwelling. Homeowners insurance, for the most part, anybody who needs a mortgage to purchase a home, which is most of us, is required to have homeowners insurance in order to get a mortgage, in order to buy the home. Similarly, home appraisals, and then zoning and land use. So the Fair Housing Act defines a dwelling as not only an actual existing dwelling, but any, vacant lot, any land that could be used for residential use. So zoning and land use ordinances and decisions are considered to be covered by the Fair Housing Act. And then many other municipal policies, things like code enforcement, things like rental licensing and use and occupancy permitting procedures are all covered by the Fair Housing Act because those policies affect people's access to housing.
Rachel, we just had our first question come in the chat, and it's about
Okay,
55 and
great.
older communities.
Yes.
Kimberly asked, how did 55 and older communities come about if you cannot discriminate based on age?
Okay, great question. So the Fair Housing Act has several exemptions. And I would say the housing for older persons is the most common one of those exemptions. So there's certain very narrow exemptions for um, certain types of private rentals when a home's owner occupied and there's only one other unit and the homeowner doesn't use a real estate professional. There's certain exemptions for religious organizations and private clubs. There's very, very, very narrow for sale by owner exemptions that actually are not exempt in Pennsylvania, so you don't have to worry about those. And then there's really the most common exemption is housing for older persons. So housing for older persons is covered by the Housing for Older Persons Act, and it's defined as either, there are two types of housing for older persons. One is every unit is occupied by only people who are 62 and older. And then there's the 55 and older housing. So that means that at least 80% of units need to be occupied by at least one person over the age of 65. And then the complex needs to follow certain procedures to ensure that those benchmarks are maintained. They need to have kind of an age verification process, and every 2 years they need to document that community maintains those demographics related to age. So if they designate themselves as age restricted under these procedures that are set forth by the Housing for Older Persons Act, they are permitted to exclude families with children. So that's probably the most common Fair Housing Act exemption. So this is the basically everyone slide. I'm not going to read all of this off, but anybody who has power or influence over consumers' access to housing is covered by the Fair Housing Act. So this can include, neighbors who are acting as informal agents of housing providers. It can include maintenance people, listing services, builders and developers. It really, anyone who has any effect over other people's access to housing can be liable under the Fair Housing Act. And then penalties for violating the Fair Housing Act. So I did mention that there are a number of different venues in which an individual can bring a fair housing complaint. There's the administrative complaint process through HUD or a federal lawsuit. DOJ handles systemic complaints of housing discrimination, which basically means that it affects more than just one individual. It affects multiple. Um, it's like a pattern and practice of discrimination that affects larger numbers of people. And then on the state level, under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, there's a similar set of choices for enforcement. There's an administrative complaint process under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, a lawsuit in Commonwealth Court, or the AG's office accepts systemic complaints of housing discrimination. Individuals who have been determined to have experienced discrimination can receive economic and non-economic damages in a settlement agreement. In a lot of situations, people suffer real economic harm from being discriminated against. We've had, for example, homeowners who were trying to sell their home and they had buyers who experienced discrimination in the home buying process, which meant that they couldn't sell their home and experienced economic harm due to that. I have a mortgage complaint later on in this presentation that I'll talk about. Lots of people in rentals end up anything from having to take time off of work to having to move their kids to a different school district to having a longer commute can result in economic damages. And then non-economic damages would be things like emotional damages, distress, humiliation. Fair housing resolutions typically involve relief in the public interest. So that's things like the provider needing to adopt new policies which comply with the Fair Housing Act, sometimes additional policies around affirmative marketing. Typically, the employees of the provider need to get fair housing training. There are punitive damages available in situations where the discriminatory conduct was willful, as opposed to being kind of inadvertent or, conduct that comes out of ignorance. Civil penalties, there's a schedule of civil penalties that may be imposed, which is essentially a fine. Government monitoring, typically any type of fair housing case agreement will involve follow-up monitoring of a provider's practices for a period of time following the resolution. Fair Housing Act cases are fee shifting, so a prevailing plaintiff may have their attorney's fees paid for as part of a settlement. Injunctions, so the types of things that we've seen are something like in a case where a provider was engaging in conduct like harassment, that person may need to hire an agent to deal with consumers as part of a settlement. And then a loss of tax credits can occur for providers who utilize that type of funding for developing, typically subsidized housing. Okay, so a couple notes on permissible activities under the Fair Housing Act. It's really important to realize that what the Fair Housing Act covers is discrimination based on one of the protected classes. So we certainly get, you know, dozens upon dozens of calls from people who have experienced something that they view as unfair. It may be something that's unfair, but in order to be a fair housing case, it has to be based on one of those protected classes. It has to be discriminatory. Um, so the Fair Housing Act doesn't guarantee any person a right to housing or financial services that they can't afford. So in order to prevail in a fair housing case or to be protected under the Fair Housing Act, the person needs to actually be qualified for the housing that they're seeking. And part of proving a fair housing case involves proving that, except for the protected class that they were discriminated against, the individual seeking housing was financially qualified and qualified in any other way for that housing. And then property owners may set rents or sale prices at whatever the market will bear. And we don't have any rent control or anything like that in Pennsylvania. We got a lot of complaints particularly during the pandemic, when we had that really fast escalation of prices, about frustration from buyers that were in the market who were having a hard time buying a home, who were having a hard time competing um, with other consumers or sometimes with investors. And it's important the Fair Housing Act doesn't require that an owner accept, a lower sales price or anything like that. And then an agent or property owner can refuse to rent to a person or to engage with a person for providing housing related services if they have reliable information that the person has a recent history of violent, disruptive, or destructive behavior. And this really has to be reliable information and it has to be relevant to the housing that they are seeking. So it has to be not based on speculation or stereotypes of a person's disability or a person's race, but it has to be, truly reliable information that that person may not be an acceptable tenant for, um, you know, a, a, a true concern. So an agent or property owner can adopt and apply uniform, objective, and non-discriminatory criteria designed to evaluate the consumer's qualification. And that can involve credit worthiness, income level, something like criminal history. All of these criteria need to be applied equally across the board to everyone. And they have to be, again, objective, that really are relevant to qualifying for the type of housing that the consumer is applying for. So a note on this, that HUD does have guidance on criminal records that say that there are situations where overly broad criminal history criteria can have a discriminatory effect. So typically, a blanket ban on tenants or residents that have any type of criminal history, whether it be uh, just an arrest or a conviction, regardless of what the nature or severity of the offense was, if there's a blanket ban on, for example, any tenants with any type of criminal history, that is likely to be considered discriminatory. We've
Rachel?
had a relatively recent case about this that resulted in a revised policy that the provider was required to adopt. So if you have more questions about this, if you want a sample policy that came out of an actual case, you can certainly contact me afterwards. The important thing about this is that it goes back to an appropriate consideration of what's going to make somebody a good tenant or a good resident. If it's a 30-year-old shoplifting violation, that is not a concern. But if it's something recent or violent, then yes, it's appropriate to consider that sort of criminal history.
Rachel, I
And
think we
then,
may have had a question. I'm not sure. I think I heard someone. Did somebody have a question?
A
okay,
question came in chat, but I think you just answered it. So, Barb asked specifically about registered sex offenders, but I think you just
okay, yeah,
answered it.
yeah, that would be an example of something that is appropriate to consider.
Mhm.
So, it's criminal history is not a protected class, but there is the obligation to look at criminal history on an individual basis and really be sure that whatever criteria are being applied are directly related to somebody's likelihood of being a good tenant. And then there's an exemption to the criminal history guidance that um, nobody's ever required to rent to somebody who's been convicted of the manufacture or distribution of illegal drugs. Also, while addiction is covered as a disability under the Fair Housing Act, nobody is ever required to rent to a current user of illegal drugs. So just a couple of exemptions to, HUD gives us the the criminal history guidance, and then kind of an exemption to that, where it's always um, going to be considered okay to exclude people on that basis.
Rachel, I actually have a question. Does that vary state to state, or is that nationwide?
Under the Fair Housing Act, the so we get a lot of questions, for example, about medical marijuana. Can somebody request, you know, the use of medical marijuana as a reasonable accommodation? So, despite the fact that drug laws do vary by state on the federal level, everything's still considered an illegal controlled substance. And so, under the Fair Housing Act, it does not vary by state.
Thanks.
Yeah, that is a common recent question. So, some best practices to avoid discrimination and to also avoid the appearance of discrimination. Um, so, one of the things that we get a lot is, people calling us and they believe somebody is discriminating against them because they have I'm going to say a lack of professionalism. I always tell this story again to realtors because I think it illustrates how sometimes non-discriminatory behavior can present to a consumer as discriminatory. We had a home seeker contact us who said that they believed they were being discriminated against because of their race. And they said that the real estate agent that they had contacted wasn't returning their calls. They stood them up for an appointment to view a home. They felt that they were being treated rudely and dismissively. And so, one of the things that we do at our office is we conduct fair housing testing, which is essentially mystery shopping. So this was, a testable complaint. Often complaints come to us, and it's somebody who doesn't necessarily have evidence that discrimination has happened, but they have a feeling that discrimination has happened. So in this case, we had several testers contact the real estate agent, attempt to find out information about homes that were on the market and attempt to view some homes. And we found that this particular real estate agent, um, hopefully not one of your members, was really just not a great real estate agent. They were not returning anybody's calls. They were not particularly attentive to anyone who called them and were kind of presenting not really excellent customer service to anyone who called. So in this case, we were able to go back to the individual and say, you just happened to call an agent who probably is in the the wrong line of work and that she's been non-responsive to all of the callers, as best as we can observe. So this was an example where that individual could feel like, okay, it wasn't discrimination, it wasn't me, it was the agent. And in that case, we were able to prevent the filing of a complaint where there probably was not discrimination occurring. But it's important to know that having inconsistent procedures or policies that aren't transparent, by treating people differently based on other things, based on favoritism, or just having inconsistent policies, can look to a consumer like discrimination. And we find that does happen, and that type of inconsistency and lack of professionalism can put housing professionals at greater risk of having a discrimination complaint filed against them when it's perceived by customers, as being potentially discriminatory. So I would also just review all of your policies and procedures, make sure that they're not unintentionally discriminatory, make sure they don't have a discriminatory effect on members of protected classes. If you work for a larger office or employ additional staff, you should implement a non-discrimination policy and make sure that that's something that everyone's aware of. And if you ever need any help with reviewing policies or reviewing, any type of non-discrimination policies or practices, we can certainly help with that. Um, so if you are in a situation where you're developing qualification criteria, whether it be for, for a rental or a sales situation. I know as realtors, you're often dealing with people who have completed, pre-qualifications or pre-approvals already with a mortgage company. But if you're ever in a situation where you have to assess somebody's qualification, make sure those are all factual and objective criteria that you're using and that they're being applied equally to everyone. I would say things like, you know, if you have a policy that just for security, you're asking to see people's ID or anything like that, just make sure you're really consistent about that. Um, One of the things that's really important with clients that are asking you for listings for homes for sale is to make sure that you're searching for listings that meet the criteria that is defined by the consumer, that you're not making suggestions that narrow down the potential set of listings that they're requesting. And, I think that's really important with something like geography to make sure that to avoid any appearance of steering, that if a client, for example, is really vague about what the geographical area that they'd like to search for homes in, really have them be the one that narrows that down to a manageable area. If somebody comes to you and says that they want to buy a home in Delaware County, that person probably needs to do some more homework in there, on their own, on their own time about what might be the most appropriate municipalities or neighborhoods that they'd like to consider. Um, Retain all documentation for at least 2 years. So the Fair Housing Act has a statute of limitations of 2 years where if an individual is going to file a fair housing lawsuit, they need to do so um, within a 2-year period of when they're alleging the discriminatory conduct took place. So we always recommend to any housing provider that you save documentation for 2 years. And then for your protection, if anyone has made any request that you feel may have any type of um, request from a seller that might be requesting that you discriminate or implying that they have discriminatory preferences, if you have a request from a buyer that you feel like may have any type of discriminatory implication or fair housing implication, I would just document that. Just an extreme example, if you were asked by a seller to um, to discriminate, you would want to make a written note of that, note the date that that occurred, what the seller said, and your response. So just documentation is really important in an actual fair housing complaint. Consider giving your clients a written fair housing statement when you first start working with them. It's, I think, effective to kind of preempt any potential discriminatory requests, or even a complainant or a client talking about, questionable topics if you're upfront that you comply with the Fair Housing Act. Um, we really recommend that you don't provide any information regarding prospective buyers, protected classes to sellers. We really, from a Fair Housing Act perspective, discourage the, buyer letter with any type of personal information or photos that can give the buyer the opportunity to to consider buyers in a more biased way. So we do discourage having buyers present, personal appeals of any kind. Any questions from buyers about demographics, about things like crime rate, school districts, religious institutions nearby? We also recommend that you don't answer those questions yourself. I think that, again, that gets towards the potential for bias pretty easily. It gets towards the appearance of steering pretty easily. And we really recommend that you have some resources to refer buyers to that. I think it's very understandable that home buyers want school district information. They want information about things like crime rates, but it's really on them to do that type of research themselves. And we all know that some of that information has been used to make implications about, for example, the race of a neighborhood. Make sure all staff receive regular fair housing training. That's something that we certainly do provide periodically. And you can contact us at any time for assistance with specific issues and questions. We take anonymous requests for technical assistance. You don't even have to identify yourself if you're not comfortable with that, but you can, ask us anything that comes up, call or email anytime.
Rachel, we had another question come
Okay.
in from Aaron, and I might need more clarification on what this means, but you might be able to take this away. What is the most common, easily avoidable thing that comes up in fair housing complaints?
I would say just because it's the most common type of complaint that we get overall, I would say a reluctance to consider reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And some examples of how that might come up in a home buying situation. We've had people with, like, who were hard of hearing, who were had visual impairments, ask for accommodations from a realtor, to have information conveyed to them in certain ways. And just, I think that's the one that comes to mind immediately that I can recall we've gotten in a home buying situation. But it's the biggest problem that we see, that housing providers are just kind of dismiss any request for deviation from their ordinary policies. And it's important to know that any housing provider is obligated to, consider all requests for reasonable accommodations. And we can help with that as well if you're not sure what the standards are, what you're required to accommodate. You can let us know what your questions are. But I would say just by far, probably fully half of the complaints that we receive in a year involve a denial of reasonable accommodations or modifications. Okay, so just a couple of examples of fair housing issues in transactions related to home buying. I just picked a couple of transactions and recent cases that we've dealt with that might be of some interest, kind of some tips of how to advocate for your clients in various transactions. The other thing that I like to say about fair housing for realtors is that a lot of what we do is compliance training. It's teaching you how to comply with the Fair Housing Act. I will say that in this day and age, we tend to get more complaints from realtors than about realtors. We have a lot of real estate agents who call us with a concern that their client has been discriminated against in another transaction. And they're calling us for advice on how to advocate for their client or to assist their compliant and or their client. I'm sorry. And this happens in all sorts of situations. We have a lot of agents who have clients who encounter discriminatory policies in HOAs. That's where we hear about a lot of reasonable accommodation issues from realtors that their clients are experiencing. So the next part of this presentation is, how you can use fair housing to advocate for your clients in the multiple other transactions that they're engaged in while buying a home. So in mortgage lending, I would say one of the best thing is to just make sure your clients are educated on what they qualify for going into searching for a loan. That now we have lots of access to different loan calculators. Have them call around and they will be able to notice if they're offered a loan where the terms are something that's less than what they qualify for, or if they're improperly denied a loan. We really feel like consumer education is the best way to kind of preemptively address the potential for discrimination in housing related financial transactions. One of the things that we see sometimes, maybe not so much as during the era of really egregious predatory lending, but we do see product steering where consumers are steered towards a particular type of loan instead of the full range of products that they're qualified for. And again, I think education is the key to this. They should really make sure that they understand what is most appropriate for their situation. Then if they're denied and if this is not offered by the lender under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, they're entitled to an explanation of why the denial happened, and they should, you know, make sure to review that and make sure that it is indeed legitimate. So here's our recent example of a lending complaint. This was a complaint from a couple of years ago. We had a couple contact us. It was a married couple who had just had their second child, and they were denied a home. It was a refinance loan to they were planning some renovations, and they were denied a loan by the local credit union, the Police and Fire Federal Credit Union. Um, and they had been pretty upfront that the reason why they were denied was that the wife was on maternity leave. So she was a nurse. She was receiving fully paid maternity leave and had a scheduled date to return to work. She had, gone back to work after the birth of her first child and was told by the loan officer that, being on maternity leave, they had no way of knowing if she would return, and that she would have to reapply when she had been back to work for about a month and had received at least two pay stubs. So in this case, we were able to, do an investigation. We were able to obtain legal representation for the complainants, and she had to she filed a complaint, and they received a settlement where they received monetary damages. They had missed out in this case on a lower interest rate during the point in time when there were really, beneficial interest rates available, and the lender had to change their policies relating to maternity leave. So, fair housing issues and homeowners insurance. This is another one that we have seen locally. So, insurance discrimination usually occurs rather than against an individual for a discriminatory reason. It's usually based on the race of the neighborhood where the house is located. And a lot of these discriminatory policies by homeowners insurance companies are what we call disparate impact discrimination, which means that the policy itself is facially neutral. It's applied across the board, but it has the effect of discriminating against a group of people more. It has a disproportionate effect on one group of people as compared to another group of people. So, policies in homeowners insurance, like companies that won't insure homes with flat roofs, or won't insure homes over a certain age, or won't insure homes under a certain value. Just looking at our region, you can see that this excludes, the city of Chester, a lot of neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Norristown, Coatesville. It excludes entire neighborhoods and cities that have these characteristics. And so maybe about 15 years ago, many of the big insurance companies, the State Farms and the Allstates, were sued for race discrimination based on these policies that were excluding, older cities and neighborhoods that had these characteristics. So, what we find now is that discrimination is more likely to happen with the smaller companies or individual agents than, these bigger companies that have been subject to um, fair housing lawsuits and that have engaged in settlements which required them to change their policies. So again, I would really encourage clients to shop around for a price. We find that when we're doing testing, that homeowners insurance policies vary a lot more widely than you would expect. So again, education is really key for um, consumers to identify whether discrimination may be occurring. So the case example on this one is a little bit different than these examples that I've talked about. Um, and it was, and you can advance the slide, thank you. So this was a small insurance agency located in Allentown. Um, and they were basically screening people on the phone by the sound of their voice. And when individuals called who they perceived as being Spanish speaking or when they perceived as being African American by the sound of their voice on the phone, they would ask those individuals to provide their social security number before they would give them a quote. Whereas people that they believed that were white, based on the sound of their voice on the phone, they would provide a written insurance quote too. So again, this resulted in a HUD complaint. It resulted in the insurance company needing to revise its policies. In this case, our organization was an organizational complainant, so they did reimburse our organization for some of the investigation costs. They paid to have compliance testing in the future to ensure that they were complying with the law going forward. And then they donated to a first time homebuyer program to provide grants for some of their clients to offset their first year of homeowners insurance through their home buyer program. And then another big issue, probably everyone's seen this in the news. There have been a lot of news stories on race discrimination in appraisals. And this is a situation where an appraiser improperly undervalues houses due either to the race of the neighborhood that the home is located in or the race of the individuals who reside in the home. So for most transactions, if the buyer needs a mortgage to purchase the home, if the appraisal is lower than the agreed upon sales price, then the home sale cannot go forward unless it's renegotiated. Again, like with mortgages, the the consumer is entitled to an explanation of why the appraisal came in low. And And they should read that over. They should see whether the comparable home sales that have been chosen are actually accurate, whether they're really in the same neighborhood, whether they're really similar homes, and whether they're kind of, you know, negative comments that may be really subjective and may not accurately reflect the value of the home. So we have a current, this is a pending case. So it's our practice not to identify the company in this case, because this one is still in progress. But this is a case that's really, really similar to a lot of those news stories that have happened within the last couple of years. This was an interracial couple who lived in West Philadelphia. They were attempting to refinance their mortgage, and so they got an appraisal. Initially, it was in January. The wife, who was white, was home for the appraiser's visit. They just kind of did an appraisal to try to see what their home was valued at that point. The appraisal report came in with a value of $640,000. In the meantime, they did some renovations and improvement. They did landscaping and finished the basement. And they applied at that point for a refinance loan. So that was 5 months later. This was again during a time when home prices were increasing. And the appraisal, where the husband, who was Black, was the only one present during the appraiser's visit, came back at $570,000. Then they contacted us at that point because they felt like the appraisal was low and was not correct. We had them order a third appraisal at that point in June to have only the wife present during that appraisal, and the home at that point was valued at $750,000. So that's a pending case. This one is a little bit, of a more novel complaint and, still in process, but we believe that the facts of this case indicate that there was a probability of race discrimination occurring. Okay, so those were the recent cases I wanted to share, and I'm just going to give you some basic information about our services that we offer and then take any additional questions. So we provide services both to consumers who believe that they've experienced discrimination. We can offer counseling, information advice about individuals' rights. As I explained, we do fair housing testing investigations and enforcement services. We can help with attaining legal representation, with helping people who have experienced discrimination to decide what complaint process is the most appropriate to their situation, whether they seem to have sufficient evidence to go forward with a complaint. We can talk through all of these issues with them. We also, if you have a client who you believe is experiencing discrimination, you can certainly contact them on our behalf, and we can evaluate their situation. Then we offer all types of education, training programs, technical assistance for a variety of other audiences. Like I said previously, any compliance questions you have, any individual situations that you want to discuss with us, you can definitely call or email, and we will help you out the best we can. And then we have a bunch of publications that cover a variety of fair housing topics, particularly for rentals. If any of you also deal with rental transactions, we have some really comprehensive manuals for both renters and rental housing providers, and then just tons of other brochures, fact sheets, um, 3 different websites, lots of fair housing information. I believe our website is on the next page. Our phone number. So here's where you can call us to report discrimination or to request training, talk to anybody about a fair housing situation, ask a fair housing question. You can just give us a call directly. Website should be on the next page. Yes. So you can visit equalhousing.org for any of our resources. There will be links out to our other 2 websites, renters.equalhousing.org and landlords.equalhousing.org are the renter rights and landlord responsibilities website. And then contact information for both myself and the colleague that provides technical assistance, answers to fair housing questions to providers. You can call or email either one of us. And any additional questions?
Rachel, I'm going back to one that we got earlier in the chat. She requested that we ask it at the end if there's time.
Okay.
Um, it's about criminal backgrounds. So my question is about criminal background as it relates to fair housing, since it is not a protected class, but can affect units in other units in the buildings that are multi-unit. Question came from Teresa.
Yeah, so again, what the HUD guidance says, and I can provide, if you want to contact me later, I can point you to that HUD guidance, and I can also give you some sample policies that have been considered to be good policies. So the HUD guidance says, unlike the way that we say with most things, you have to pick one policy and apply it equally across the board. The HUD guidance requires that you consider criminal backgrounds on a case by case basis. So you're supposed to consider the nature of the offense, the severity of the offense. So, was it something that was a misdemeanor or a felony? Was it, violent or non-violent? You're supposed to consider how recently it took place. Was this, a very recent situation, or did it occur in the far past? You're supposed to consider mitigating circumstances or evidence of rehabilitation. So we have had some examples of cases where there have been complainants who had a mental health disability that was untreated, and they had, for example, like uninhibited behavior that resulted in a criminal record. And then they were later effectively treated for that mental health disability, and they're able to produce, like a letter from a medical professional or therapist that verifies that, this happened due to an untreated disability and it's unlikely to occur because they're receiving now effective treatment, effective medication. So that would be an example of a mitigating circumstance that's related to a protected class. But basically, you're obligated to, rather than saying, no criminal history of any kind, you're obligated to consider them case by case and to take into account whether they're factors that are truly going to affect whether somebody can be a good tenant now or not. So there's some gray area there for sure. There isn't a hard and fast rule, but it does say that there's an obligation to make individual considerations and to give applicants the opportunity to present information about the incident for your consideration. So it's complicated. There's gray area, but feel free to be in touch if you want to talk something through or if you would like me to send you some additional resources.
Awesome. In the interest of keeping in touch, I left the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania's direct link in the chat for everyone, along with all of Rachel's contact information, email, phone, and all of that. We also have a page on our website that links back directly to the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania, and it has a bunch of their manuals that they provide. It's like direct links. So if you go to our website under DEI resources, you will find that there. It's everything from LGBTQ discrimination, what to do if you think you've experienced housing discrimination, zoning and land use, all their quick button or quick hot button manuals and guides. So they all live there.
Great, excellent.
Mhm. Any more questions for Rachel? No? Okay. Well, well, they have your contact information regardless.
Great, great. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone. And again, feel free to be in touch.
Thank
Even
you,
if you want
Rachel.
to ask questions anonymously, reach out anytime.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Great information. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Karen.
Thank you.